Hey there, this is Troy Yamaguchi here with Plus Two, and this is our first installment of the Star Wars Unlimited Competitive Bible. This is a series where we discuss some of the theory and decisions that form the basis of a competitive approach to card games, and today we're going to be talking about critical deck building. This term is a constellation of some of the background decisions that take place before you even sign up for a tournament, and we're going to be talking about some of the thought processes that go into choosing and optimizing a deck and providing some of the tools to take an analytical approach to your next big tournament, whether that's a planetary qualifier or a store showdown or even just your next local. So, like I said, the first lesson here is going to be all about choices that happen before the tournament. We're going to be talking about setting goals for what you want your deck to accomplish and some indicators of competitively powerful choices. And then once we've verified our approach to the format, we're going to be talking about some of the mathematical concepts behind success or failure in an actual tournament. We're going to be talking about the power of probability and how to account for bad luck or variance. And we're going to start touching on some of the mathematical questions that we might ask ourselves to try to get an edge during the deck building process. Now, there are a lot of math concepts that I do want to talk about, but we won't be able to get into all of them here. So in the future, I will be making a series of videos with examples on how exactly to break down in-game situations into mathematical outcomes. But that's to come later. Speaking of later, while we're talking about all of these preparation concepts today, I want us to look forward to the next series of topics, which will be in-game decision making. These will be a next series of lessons. I think there's enough on each of these to have their own individual videos, but all of these concepts today that we're going to be talking about will have an impact on how you actually make decisions during the game. But that's to come later. So let's get into the topic for today, which is critical deck building. So, if you're familiar at all with card game theory, you may have heard this term or a term very much like it elsewhere. The most common synonym I've heard elsewhere is problem solving deck building, but basically, this is the concept that when you're building a deck, you're not just slapping random cards together. Of course, when we're building a deck, we want to have some kind of idea in mind of the deck's purpose. And the idea of critical deck building is that the more you refine a deck's purpose, and the more critically you evaluate the inclusions or exclusions of a deck, the more consistently successful you'll be. So the definition for the day, when we're building a deck, we want to have a purposeful arrangement of cards where everything about the deck is working together to bring about some kind of desired goal. I want to take a brief moment to mention that this concept doesn't just apply to a competitive context. The topic we're going to discuss today forms a general framework to improve any kind of deck, whether we're trying to win a big event or if we're just going to locals and trying to resolve like the funniest Endless Legion meme, for example. Critical deck building is just the thought process of, for each individual card in our deck, asking analytical questions such as, how does this help accomplish my goal? And validating that our deck is built correctly to bring that goal about. So again, it can be anything from a casual goal, so just to play fun cards that you like, to winning a big tournament. But when we're talking about goals today, we will be talking about a competitive context, and this is just because a competitive context assumes the fewest outside factors. And what I mean by this is that when we're building a competitive deck, our only goal is to win the game, to destroy the enemy base and to prevent them from destroying ours. And any outside factor, such as winning the game in a way that we deem fair or fun or using characters that we like, is putting additional concepts on that most basic goal of winning the game. So in a competitive context, we'll be trying to build the most powerful deck possible. And by powerful, we mean a deck that wins the most games as frequently and by as far a margin as we can. So how do we go about doing that? Well, I thought about some of the various things that I personally look for when choosing a deck, and the kind of maybe verbose definition that I came to in what makes a deck powerful is the following. I always look for a streamlined, consistent game plan that is proactively superior to alternatives and is resilient into the field of expectations. Now, if we want to simplify these concepts, my goal in building a deck is to typically have three things. I'm looking for consistency, which is that the deck does what it does every single time and with as few, we'll say, like weird hands as possible. I also want specialization. I want my deck to do what it does better than any other option that could accomplish the goal that I have, because if there's a better option out there, well, then I want to just play that deck instead. So I want a deck with specialization, something that does what it does better than any others. And then finally, I do want a deck that has resilience. which is that when I take a deck to a tournament, I do expect my opponent to also have done these steps and to have a deck with cards with text on them. So I want to be sure that my strategy can survive whatever it is that my opponents are doing and that it doesn't just crumble immediately to any sort of viable strategy. So that is the concept of resilience. That's the final thing that I look for. So I want to put this together into a concrete example. I'm going to take Sabine. I think this is a very commonly played deck. I think that we can all agree that it's a perfectly valid deck to consider taking to a competitive event. And I want to break this deck down in terms of these dimensions to kind of show what goes into making a competitively viable deck. So how does Sabine fit the criteria we've just established? Well, consistency. Every card in Sabine is definitely geared towards pushing a pretty consistent strategy, which is just pushing damage and ending the game as fast as possible. You have high statted units that work together. You have powerful event pump and burn spells. And then you finally have this kind of unique, powerful once a game action in the form of Energy Conversion Lab. Okay, so this is definitely a deck that we can say has a coherent game plan that all of its cards are working together to accomplish. Well, what about specialization? Well, when I think about Sabine, I might consider it against other options, right? Why would I play Sabine over, say, Kylo Ren, who's another aggressive strategy? Well, one thing I really like about Sabine is that it gets a ton of mileage out of its Energy Conversion Lab play. I think this gives the deck a very strong point of interaction that other aggro decks tend to lack, and it does help a lot in aggro mirror matches, just being able to throw a guy out there early, take a dude off their board, and accomplish something with the rest of your board. So I think that Sabine gets to play some of the best Energy Conversion Lab targets in the game. It has K2, Poe, and Wrecker. These are all very good units at 4 through 6, so it's always going to have access to one of these over the course of the game. So I think that's a pretty good reason to pick Sabine over some of the competition. For example, picking Sabine over Kylo Ren on the basis that I like this Energy Conversion Lab play. Okay, so now finally I've decided that Sabine might be a good choice to take into the field. What are some of the obstacles that we might encounter? This gets into the topic of resilience, which in my opinion is probably one of the most important questions to ask because it establishes, is this game plan worth playing at all? So if I'm considering bringing Sabine to a tournament, I have to evaluate the threats that I expect to be in the room. I have to ask myself questions like, how much removal will I expect to be played on the 3-resource turn, right? If my early plays get killed, do I still have enough in my deck to generate aggression to end the game, right? Another thing that I might be scared about when I'm considering Sabine at a tournament is the card Cunning and the Cunning archetype, right? This tempo strategy is pretty good at stopping my aggression. So if I know that I'm going to encounter this deck a lot at an upcoming tournament, and my goal is to do as well at this tournament as I can, I might want to reconsider bringing Sabine to this tournament after all. So these are some of the theoretical decisions that go through my head when I'm evaluating a strategy. The next thing to begin to account for once we've gone through this process and chosen our strategy is how to overcome what we call the game of probability. A joke that I frequently tell when my friends or even my opponents are complaining about bad luck in card games is that if we wanted to play a game of skill, we would go play chess, right? Card games are inherently volatile and there will always be a component of luck involved in tournament results. But another way of looking at that is controlling variance is just another one of your responsibilities as the player, right? And optimizing our deck choices in spite of this variance can be seen as an expression of skill that takes place before the tournament starts. And that's going to be the real focus of what we're talking about today, is how to always try to be preparing for this variance in the deck building process. So this is where the math starts. Let's say, for example, that I have decided after all to take Sabine to a tournament, right? A good starting point in terms of accounting for variance and making sure that my deck is functional and powerful might be this basic line here. I need to start with a good turn 1 play, because if I don't, and if I do nothing on turn 0, I can't be aggressive, which is what my deck wants to do. My game ends, my whole strategy crumbles, right? So let's look into ways that we can try to build our deck to always see a good turn 1 play, right? So the most obvious thing to look at is the number of turn 1 plays that we have access to, right? Most Sabine decks play some organization of the following cards. You probably have 3 Sabine unit, 3 Battlefield Marine, 3 A-Wing, 3 X-Wing. Sometimes they play the Pathfinder, but there's usually some organization of 2 drops, right? So if we have this lineup here, we'll have 12 plays total, and this might seem good enough to just move on and go to the next question in our deck building process, but critical deck building tells us that we should look more into this decision and validate our decision in some way. So what's the best way to do this? Well, in a game of probability, it helps to know exactly which probabilities we're opting into. And the best tool for this is what's called a hypergeometric calculator. I've linked one of the most common ones in the comments, but you have a bunch of other options out there. Even I personally use a spreadsheet when I'm getting really deep into the weeds. This sheet of mine gives the same calculation as the example that I linked, but it requires fewer button presses, so I like it for that reason. In the future, once I've refined the sheet and have added some additional functionality, we'll be posting a video showing just how exactly to use this tool and sharing the sheet publicly. But for now, just keep in mind that all of the probability calculations we're using for this lecture will be cumulative hypergeometric calculations. And when we're using this math, we're trying to validate some of our deck building goals. Back with Sabine, my question is, are my 12 turn 1 plays, my 3 Sabines, 3 Battlefield Marine, my 3 A-Wing, and my 3 X-Wing, is that good enough, right? So as a baseline, I do always want to be able to play the game. And to do that, I need to see at least one 2-drop in my opening 6 cards. As it turns out, the math on that to see at least one turn 1 play out of 12 in your opening 6 turns out to be 82.63%. Okay, so then that now leaves us with the chance to not see one of these plays and to be sad at 17.37%. Okay, cool. But you might say, well, I get to mulligan, right? So let's say that we are in this 17.37% chance to dead draw with sad situation, right? I'm just going to pick up my hand and I'm going to put it back into my deck. Well, okay. When I draw my next hand, I will also have that same chance to not draw a 2-drop and be sad again. So basic probability says that if we multiply the chances of these two events happening back to back, what we end up with is 17% times 70%, which gives about a 3% chance to fully brick even despite the mulligan. Okay, so we've established that we have a 3.02 chance to brick with 12 2-drops in our deck. Well, that doesn't sound that bad on paper, right? 97% is an A, right? I'm happy with that. Or am I, right? So this question is where it really gets interesting, right? Whether or not we're satisfied with this probability to brick depends on a lot of other factors. It depends on how many games and subsequently how many hands I expect to play out during the tournament. It also depends on other factors such as player preference, right? If I as a player like to mulligan for things other than just being able to play the game with my 2-drop, right? Let's say I like to mulligan for my side deck cards and I want to be able to rely on my deck to not brick me at 17% consistency rate when I'm putting my hand back in my deck, right? Those are all factors that we're going to have to consider when we're building our deck and putting out our layout of how many 2-drops we want to put in our deck, right? So let's look at this question, this first question here in a tournament setting, just because the other one's more a matter of player preference, right? Let's say I'm taking Sabine to my store showdown, right? So this is about a 5-round Swiss tournament that cuts to top 8. So this makes for 8 matches total. Well, I know that on a day, I can expect to play a maximum of 24 games, right? If every game, say, goes to game 3, 8 matches total, we'll have 24 hands maximum, right? So this means we can set our goal. All I'm going to say, my goal over the course of this entire tournament is to not brick, right? So if we calculate our rates to not brick 24 hands in a row, we get a probability of 96.98% consistency tested to the 24th power. So when you're testing that every single hand for 24 hands total, what the final math ends up being is that we will have a 47.90% chance to accomplish our goal of not bricking across the entire day, which is a little bit scary. That's below half. What if this is a longer tournament? Let's say we're taking Sabine to a sector qualifier. Let's say that we have 10 rounds of Swiss that cuts to top 32 cut. So we can expect to play a maximum of 15 matches. If we want to win the whole thing, we're going to have to go through each one of those rounds. And we'll say that if every game goes to game 3, we'll have a maximum total number of hands of 45 hands on the day. Okay, so that means our new likelihood of drawing playable all day long is 96.98 to the 45th power, right? And the math on that turns out to be only about 1 in 4. So we can look at this number and say that if we're playing a tournament of this length, we're very, very likely to drop at least one game due to our deck not functioning as a result of variance, right? We drew our hand, we didn't see a 2-drop in it, we put it back in our deck, we drew our hand again, oh gosh, this is the game that I'm going to drop because, we hit this 3.02% chance to not see a 2-drop after a mulligan. But that's not all, right? It could actually be worse. If we look at the hypergeometric calculation in this long tournament setting, we'll see that we have a high chance to drop more than one game, right? We have this 39.58% chance to drop additional games due to our not seeing a 2-drop, right? And we'll actually see that our chance to drop more than one game is higher than our chance to go the whole day unmolested, right? So now I'm a little more nervous. This might be the difference between topping or dropping out at round 9. Okay, so what can we as the player do to try to build our deck with a little more consistency? Well, I wanted to take a look at this Sabine list from Gen Con. This was my friend Andrew Evans' list that he took to top 4 at that event. And what we'll notice is that we have all the usual suspect. We have the 3 Marine, we have the 3 Sabine, we have the 3 A-Wing, the 3 X-Wing, but we also have this one Ketsu Ono as the 13th 2-drop. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, it's just one card. How much of an impact could one additional 2-drop possibly have in the outcome of our tournament? Well, let's find out. If we run the number with 13 2-drops instead of 12, we find that we now have about an 85% chance to see our 2-drop in any opening 6 that we draw, leaving us with a about 2.14% chance to fully brick after the mulligan. So our question is this 13th 2-drop creating a meaningful change to our tournament consistency? Well, let's run the store showdown number with 24 hands. We find that after doing all this math, our new consistency number to go the whole day without bricking has improved from 47.9% to 59.5%, right? So we've actually improved over the 50-50 threshold, and that's good, right? We're at least now more likely to make it through the whole tournament than not. What about the long sector tournament example with 45 hands tested? Well, here we end up at 37.77% chance to make it all the way through without bricking as compared to just 25%. And you may say, well, that number is still low, but by adding just one single card, we've improved our chances of accomplishing our goal of not bricking from about 1 out of 4 to 1 out of 3. And for one card, that's not very bad. But I guess we still haven't fully answered, right? Is this new consistent deck an impactful improvement? And that's where the nuance really starts to come in. We have verified that by changing our deck list from 12 to 13 2-drops, we've increased the consistency, but we still have to establish whether or not this increased consistency is worth doing against other option. So again, the question of tournament length comes back into play. This chart shows the difference in consistency at various tournament lengths. The x-axis here is the number of hands that you'll draw. And what we see is that the consistency functions described by our 2 different decks, again, these are just one card different. These 2 functions do not move in parallel. So when you have a more consistent deck here, you actually get a better return at the 45 hand sample than the 25 hand sample. And if we're just going to locals, you'll look and see that the 2 lines are actually fairly close together and that the difference isn't nearly as meaningful. When we're having this whole critical discussion on whether or not we should include this 13th 2-drop, these are some of the factors that are going through our mind. We're constantly questioning and validating, is what we're doing improving our situation? And if it is, in what context is it improving our situation? Under what conditions? Using this graph, we might say something like, having the 13th 2-drop gives a very big benefit in the 45 hand tournament. It gives a medium benefit in the 25 hand tournament. And if we're just taking it to locals, you know what? Maybe I just throw something funny in there instead of Ketsu Ono. Another thing is that we haven't considered the independent possibility that Ketsu Ono isn't even a very good card to play. If our deck is more consistent, but the card that we end up playing out isn't actually worth playing, we haven't even made our deck any better. We haven't considered other things like what other options do we have instead of Ketsu Ono? Should we be playing an R2 in that spot? Because it gives us additional flexibility to fill curve on later turns? Should we be playing Rebel Pathfinder because we prioritize the 2-3 stat line over a 3-2 stat line? So these are all questions that we have to ask ourselves when we're being critical about our deck building. The purpose of this entire discussion isn't to convince everyone that they need to play 13 2-drops in Sabine, even though I think it is a good idea to play high numbers of 2-drops in your aggressive decks. The purpose is to illustrate that when we build decks, we have to ask ourselves very targeted questions. And when we find a solution that addresses these questions, we have to always address probability and variance, right? The basic thesis of this presentation is that by asking these questions and by going through and doing the work to figure out and validate our ideas, we will have purposeful deck building that can give ourselves an edge in the tournament. So on screen, we have some of the other questions that we might have in a general sense, right? We might ask ourselves, does my deck have enough top end to win the game? Well, we might have to break that down. How much top end do I have to see? Do I have to account for the top end getting taken out of my hand by something like a Spark of Rebellion? What is my chances of seeing my ECL target by their leader turn? This is affected by things like if my opponent's deck has ramp. These are all things that we have to consider when we're building our deck. We have goals in mind, resolving specific plays, and we have to build our deck in such a way that encourages those goals to come about. So just to recap, when we're preparing for a competitive tournament, it's important to remember that our deck building decisions are tested every single round. And this becomes more and more important the longer a tournament goes on. And to this end, every choice that we make during the deck building and preparation process matters. One of my favorite ways to conceptualize card games is that they are a series of decisions that you and your opponents make, both in terms of your deck building decisions and technical play decisions, and that when you sit down across from your opponent, you're comparing rationales and reasons for making the decisions that you've made, whether that is what archetype you brought to the tournament, what cards you included in the deck, and then how you play out the cards that you're dealt. And my theory is that if your rationale and reasons are better than those of your opponents, you should generally expect to win more games than not. So to that I say, deck building edge is the cumulative result of several good choices. It's not decided just by one. It's not just decided by the deck that you choose. Whenever I'm building a deck, it's my goal to have an edge over my opponent in as many dimensions as possible before we even draw our starting hand, because I know I prepared better than them by asking all of these relevant questions. So that's the overall lesson for today. I talked a little bit about how to set goals and define a deck's purpose, and then we talked a lot about validating your deck using math. And I want to reiterate that there are very many specific examples of these kinds of math concepts, enough to fill several videos. So those will be to come. And if you want to give suggestions on those or need to ask clarifying questions about some of the things I've discussed in this video, feel free to leave some ideas in the comments. I know that we went through a little bit quick and there's a lot of technical details to cover. So if we have to expand any of these, I'm more than happy to go about doing that. Just an example of some of the other math concepts that I have in mind. I had a hilarious conversation today with Andrew actually about a potential side deck card. And this I'm pretty sure is awful, so I don't mind like going through the exhaustive reasoning, but it was a really funny conversation. At some point, one of us says like, dude, what if we side Scanning Officer in Sabine? And the theory was that it helps with the Han matchup, and we were looking for just like other fringe applications. So we go, what other decks play smuggle cards? Well, Boba Fett now plays like some amount more smuggle, right? They have Bazine. A lot of them are playing like more hotshot blaster, and then there's jetpacks and other stuff. So we thought if we slam Scanning Officer on the Boba flip turn to try to interrupt their play, like what is the chance that this actually does anything? On paper, it was almost a joke, right? It sounds like a really terrible idea, but the amount of variables was interesting to me on a theoretical basis. On screen, I have some of the questions that went through my mind when evaluating this side deck card. These are all questions that conceivably could be mathematically solved if I wanted to invest several hours into finding out if I should be playing Scanning Officer against Boba Fett. I could actually come to that conclusion and evaluate that by working out all of these situations. But for the time being, I'm just probably going to leave this in theory land. And with all these hypothetical questions, say that I'm probably not doing that. But it's always good to check. I find that very often, even good players I know get very hung up on what a card might theoretically accomplish, but don't actually go through the line of validating whether or not their scenario is realistic or worth working towards. Again, I just want to reiterate that answering questions like these is what results in purposeful deck building, which will give you an edge over your tournament if your reasons and logic for making these questions is better than your opponent's. So that's all for this lesson. Next time I'm going to be talking about some of the more technical play concepts, building on these high-level preparation decisions. That video will definitely be a lot more concrete. It's going to talk a little bit about optimal plays. It's going to talk about knowing when you have to race. It's going to talk about figuring out when you should use things for removal, and questions like that. So stay tuned for that. These videos do take a little bit of a long time to make, so that will probably come out in, I'd say, like the next few weeks. But if people find them helpful, I'm definitely more than happy to put in the work and the time into putting these about. I enjoy talking about the game theory, and it's always interesting to me to put my thoughts into words. I learn things myself as I'm going through this process. So more than happy to do it. As a final note, please feel free to share this with anyone that you think might find this conversation interesting. Share your thoughts. And of course, always subscribe for more competitive Star Wars Unlimited content. Thank you very much.